The courtyard outside Buckingham Palace was alive with its usual energy, a blend of curiosity, excitement, and wonder that tourists carried with them when they came face to face with one of London's most iconic traditions. The air was crisp with the bite of autumn, the sky shifting between grey clouds and streaks of pale sunlight that reflected on the palace gates. For the visitors pressed tightly against the barriers, the highlight was always the Queen's Guard, stoic, immovable, and as much a part of the scenery as the historic walls that rose behind them. Marcus Williams stood among them, his tall frame dressed in the red tunic and black bearskin hat that had become symbols of loyalty and discipline across centuries. His posture was perfect, his rifle positioned with ceremonial precision, his face expressionless. He was a soldier trained not to flinch, not to respond, not to acknowledge the diverse distractions or countless phones pointed in his direction. His role was to embody discipline, a living symbol of duty that tourists came from all over the world to witness. Yet, beneath the polished uniform and steel composure, Marcus felt a restlessness gnawing at him that morning. He couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was the heaviness of the clouds overhead, perhaps the restless energy of the crowd, or perhaps something deeper that told him today would not be like the others. Years of training had taught him to trust his instincts, and today, those instincts whispered that something was about to happen. As the changing of the guard approached, the sound of footsteps echoed against the stone courtyard, boots striking in unison. Tourists leaned in, their cameras flashing, their voices hushed with reverence and anticipation. The guards moved like a single unit, each motion calculated, every step steeped in tradition. For many visitors, this moment was not just entertainment, it was history in motion. But not everyone in the crowd shared that respect. Among the tourists pressed against the gate stood a man whose presence was impossible to ignore once Marcus's sharp eyes settled on him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and visibly agitated. Unlike others, who smiled or whispered excitedly, this man muttered under his breath, his scowl cutting through the festive atmosphere. He shifted on his feet impatiently, glaring at the guards with contempt instead of admiration. Marcus had seen it before: individuals who viewed the guards as props, as objects to be mocked or tested. They would wave in their faces, shout insults, or attempt to break their composure, believing it to be some kind of game. But the hostility radiating from this man was sharper, heavier, more personal. Marcus could sense it even before the situation began to unfold. His military instincts, honed through training and years of service, told him this was not just a curious tourist. The man finally acted. Raising his voice above the crowd, he shouted across the courtyard, his words dripping with venom. "You're nothing but puppets in costumes. Statues pretending to be soldiers." His voice carried, sharp and cutting, silencing nearby conversations and drawing shocked looks from other tourists. Cameras immediately turned toward him, lenses capturing the sudden disturbance. The insult stung not because Marcus was unaccustomed to disrespect, but because of what it represented. Every stitch of his uniform carried history, sacrifice, and loyalty, not just his own, but that of countless soldiers before him. To mock the uniform was to mock the values and lives it symbolized. Yet Marcus did not flinch. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his gaze remained fixed straight ahead, as if the man were invisible. Around him the crowd shifted uncomfortably, murmurs rising. Some laughed nervously, unsure if this was part of the performance. Others pulled out their phones, eager to capture a viral moment. The man wasn't finished. Fueled by the attention, he leaned against the barrier, pointing directly at Marcus. "Look at him. He can't do anything. He's a statue, a joke. You think these guards protect anything? They just stand there while the world crumbles around them." His words were loud enough to echo across the courtyard, and this time the laughter in the crowd turned uneasy. Even tourists who had come for entertainment recognized the malice behind his voice. The tension thickened. Marcus could feel the energy around him change. The rule drilled into him endlessly was simple: never react, never break protocol. No matter the insult, the gesture, or even the threat, a guard's composure was unshakable. It was a principle as old as the palace itself. But Marcus's instincts screamed that this man was testing boundaries in a way that could not be ignored. That inevitable happened. In one sudden motion, the man shoved himself past the barrier, his body crossing the invisible line that separated the guards from the public. Gasps erupted from the crowd, the sound sharp and collective, as if everyone had inhaled at the same time. Parents pulled their children back, others scrambled to record, and voices rose in alarm. The man's hand shot forward, reaching dangerously close to Marcus's pristine uniform. This was no longer just disrespect. It was intrusion. It was a challenge to the very duty Marcus had sworn to uphold. His training screamed for him to remain still, to let security intervene. But instinct, the raw, primal part of him that had kept him alive during training and service, told him this was his moment to act. Then it happened. Marcus moved. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but to the eyes of the crowd it was seismic. His head shifted, turning slightly, breaking the illusion of the immovable statue. For the first time in his career, Marcus's eyes locked onto the intruder, sharp and unyielding. Gasps rippled like waves through the onlookers, the silence that followed more deafening than the shouts had been. The royal guard had moved. The royal guard had seen. The man froze mid-motion, his bravado faltering under the intensity of Marcus's gaze. The confidence he had wielded so recklessly drained away as quickly as it had arrived. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the precise second the unshakable broke his stillness. Then Marcus did the unthinkable. In a voice low but commanding, carrying across the hushed courtyard, he spoke. "Step back." The two words shattered centuries of tradition, their echo heavier than the loudest shout. The crowd erupted in screams, cheers, and frantic whispers. Phones shook in trembling hands as people streamed the moment live to thousands, then millions. "Did you hear that?" The guard spoke. Someone shouted. Another voice echoed. "I've never seen this before in my life." The man staggered backward, eyes wide, his earlier hostility shrinking under the sheer weight of Marcus's authority. But the shock wasn't his alone. Marcus felt it too, coursing through his chest like fire. He had broken the sacred stillness, the silence that defined his role. And the world was watching. In those charged seconds, Marcus knew nothing would ever be the same. The eyes of history were upon him, the judgment of tradition, duty, and millions of strangers waiting to see what came next. What he did in the moments that followed would not only define him but ripple across the world. And as the crowd's screams rose louder, and a man's trembling form lingered uncertainly by the barrier, Marcus realized something undeniable. The story was only beginning. The courtyard outside Buckingham Palace had never felt so tense. What had started as another ceremonial morning was now something entirely different. Marcus Williams stood in his immaculate red uniform, every brass button polished, every fold pressed to perfection. But despite his stillness, everything about the atmosphere suggested something extraordinary was brewing. The tourists who had gathered for a glimpse of tradition were now caught in a moment that seemed to balance on a knife's edge. The crowd had already seen the unusual and intoxicated man stumbling far too close to the guards, hurling insults, and disrupting what should have been a sacred display of discipline. But what no one could anticipate was that Marcus, known for his flawless adherence to rules, was wrestling with something inside himself. His mind was torn between the heavy burden of his oath and the equally heavy grief that lingered after his brother's death. That grief had cracked something open in him, making this morning feel different from every other shift he had ever stood for years. Marcus had endured harassment from tourists. It came with the job. Most of the time, people respected the guards and the tradition they represented, but there were always a few who tested limits, laughing, mocking, trying to break the soldier's unflinching stare. Marcus had always held firm. It wasn't just duty, it was pride. The royal guards didn't flinch. They didn't bend, and they certainly didn't break protocol yet today. As Derek's drunken voice rang out and the crowd grew restless, Marcus felt his self-control slipping. He could hear children whispering questions to their parents, asking why the man was being so mean, why no one stopped him. He could see mothers pulling their kids back, fathers frowning in frustration, elderly couples shaking their heads. And through it all, Derek grew louder, more belligerent, convinced that the guard's silence made him invincible. But Marcus was not invincible. He was human, with blood that boiled, with pain that still felt raw every time his mind drifted to his younger brother. He remembered the funeral, the way his mother's shoulders shook when she leaned against him, the sound of bagpipes echoing in the cold air. He remembered the vow he made silently over his brother's coffin that he would live each day with. The same courage James had shown in life. Now, staring straight ahead at the palace gates, Marcus wondered if courage sometimes meant something more than silent endurance. The tension reached a breaking point when Derek leaned in dangerously close, nearly brushing against the barrel of Marcus's ceremonial rifle. His words slurred, but his tone carried arrogance and contempt. "What's the matter, soldier boy? Can't speak, can't move. Useless, the lot of you. Just statues and silly hats." Gasps rose from the crowd. The man's disrespect was no longer just irritating, it was offensive on a level that felt deeply personal to everyone watching. The phones lifted higher, dozens of lenses capturing every second. Tourists who had intended to film a ceremonial guard change were now filming history, though they didn't know it yet. Marcus's breathing slowed, his fingers tightened slightly on the rifle. For years, he had trained his body to react with discipline, his mind to filter out noise. But in this moment, something changed. For the first time in his career, he felt the weight of expectation pressed down against the weight of his own humanity. And deep inside, a decision was forming, one that would break every rule he had sworn to uphold. The silence shattered when Marcus did something so subtle yet so shocking that the crowd collectively froze. He turned his head. Not a twitch, not a flicker of movement. He fully turned his head toward Derek. The world seemed to stop spinning. Even Derek, emboldened by alcohol, stumbled back slightly, startled by the guard's piercing gaze. Those blue eyes that had once seemed distant and untouchable were now locked on him with an intensity that stripped away every ounce of his bravado. The crowd erupted into whispers, the sound carrying like a rising tide. "Did you see that?" He moved. He looked at him. People clutched at each other, realizing they were witnessing something completely outside the ordinary. The rules were unspoken but known. The guards did not move, they did not break, and they certainly did not acknowledge hecklers. And yet, here stood Marcus, staring directly into the eyes of the man who had mocked him. Derek's grin faltered. He opened his mouth to jeer again, but no words came. His throat tightened as though the air itself refused to carry his insults. He could feel the crowd's mood shift completely. No longer indifferent observers but angry witnesses, united in their disapproval of him. Then Marcus spoke. His voice was quiet but carried across the courtyard like a drumbeat, each syllable crisp, steady, and impossible to ignore. "Sir," he said, his tone neither angry nor kind, but something deeper, an acknowledgement, a confrontation, a truth spoken aloud. The word landed with force. Derek blinked, unsure of what to do. The crowd fell silent again, hanging on the edge of every moment. Marcus continued, "This uniform I wear is not for show. It represents centuries of sacrifice, discipline, and honor. My brother gave his life wearing this same uniform." His voice cracked only slightly, but it was enough to bring goosebumps to those listening. "And yet here you stand, mocking, throwing insults, as if none of that matters." The effect was electric. The crowd's eyes filled with tears, their phones forgotten for a moment as they simply watched. For many it was the first time they had heard a god speak so openly, so humanly, while in uniform. It was not just shocking, it was moving in a way that felt almost sacred. Derek stumbled, his face pale. He muttered something about not meaning harm, but his words were lost in the weight of Marcus's voice. For the first time, Derek looked small, insignificant against the immovable presence of a soldier who had chosen to break silence not out of weakness, but out of strength. Marcus took a single step forward. Gasps rippled through the crowd again. The ground beneath Derek's feet might as well have opened. "The power of that single movement overwhelming this isn't about me," Marcus said, softer now, but no less powerful. "This is about respect. Respect for those who serve, respect for traditions that bind us, respect for the people who come here seeking something greater than themselves. When you disrespect one, you disrespect all." His words carried a weight that silenced even the birds overhead. The crowd leaned in, their hearts pounding, their breath caught in their throats. This was no longer a confrontation between a drunken man and a soldier. This was a lesson, a revelation, a moment of clarity that every witness would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Derek's bravado crumbled completely. His shoulders sagged, his head hung low. For the first time that day he seemed to recognize the gravity of what he had done. His lips trembled, and though he tried to speak, no sound emerged, and the crowd, almost as one, began to clap. It started softly, a few tentative hands meeting in appreciation of Marcus's composure, but within seconds, it grew into a wave of thunderous applause, echoing off the palace walls, reverberating through the courtyard. Cheers rose, shouts of support and respect filling the air. Marcus did not smile. He did not react to the applause or the cheers. He simply returned his gaze forward, standing tall once more, the embodiment of duty and dignity. But inside, something had shifted. He had broken protocol. Yes, but in doing so, he had honored his brother, his service, and the values he stood for in a way that silence never could. What happened next would take the moment beyond Buckingham Palace, beyond London, beyond the United Kingdom itself. Phones that had captured the entire exchange were already uploading it online, where it would soon spread like wildfire. Within hours, millions around the world would see a royal guard break centuries of tradition not out of weakness, but out of courage. And as Derek melted back into the crowd, swallowed by the weight of his own shame, Marcus remained at his post, every inch the soldier his brother would have been proud to see. The video of Marcus Williams breaking protocol traveled faster than anyone could have imagined. Within minutes of the confrontation, clips were being shared across social media platforms. Tourists had uploaded the footage, and it spread like wildfire. By the time Marcus completed his shift and returned to the barracks, the incident had already been viewed hundreds of thousands of times worldwide. Back at the palace quarters, Marcus sat alone in the dressing room, peeling off his stained uniform with steady hands. The once pristine tunic was streaked with mustard, crumbs, and smears from Derek's sandwich, a painful reminder of the humiliation he had endured. Yet the uniform felt heavier than ever, as though it carried the weight of every eye that had watched him defy centuries of discipline. The rule was simple. Royal guards did not speak. They did not move unless provoked by real danger. Marcus had known this since the first day of training, and yet, when confronted by disrespect and his own grief, he had spoken. He had not shouted or lashed out. He had spoken with honesty, with dignity, with pain that had turned into strength. And now the world was watching. He stared at his reflection in the mirror. The man who looked back at him seemed older, wearier. Marcus's piercing blue eyes carried not just fatigue but the shadow of something heavier. His brother's face flickered in his memory, smiling during their last conversation, filled with dreams of the future. James would have told him he did the right thing. He would have said that silence isn't always strength, that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is speak the truth. But would his commanders see it that way? That question gnawed at Marcus more than anything else. The army valued discipline above all else, and protocol wasn't just tradition, it was sacred. Breaking it, no matter the reason, was a serious offense. He could already imagine being called before his superior officers, forced to explain himself. Would they understand the grief that had pushed him to break silence? Or would they see only the violation of a centuries-old standard? As he sat there, the door opened quietly. Sergeant Harris, his immediate superior, entered the room. Harris was a stocky man in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of stern expression that rarely softened. He closed the door behind him and looked at Marcus for a long moment before speaking. "You've caused quite a stir today," Harris said finally, his voice low but not unkind. "The entire palace is buzzing. I've had 3 calls already from the press office asking for a statement. And that video, it's everywhere. Millions have already seen it." Marcus straightened slightly, bracing for reprimand. "I broke protocol, sir. I accept whatever consequences come." Harris studied him carefully. "Yes, you broke protocol. But you also did something else. You reminded people that behind these uniforms, there are men, real men, with families, with grief, with honor. The public doesn't often see that." Marcus's chest tightened. "With respect, sir, my duty is not to be seen as a man. It's to stand as a symbol, to represent something larger than myself." "True," Harris agreed, folding his arms. "But symbols mean nothing if people forget the humanity behind them. You may have broken a rule today, Marcus, but you've also reminded the world why those rules matter in the first place. Because they're carried by men who bleed, who grieve, who sacrifice." Marcus didn't know what to say. He had expected anger, disappointment, even punishment. Instead, he found a flicker of understanding in Harris's eyes, something rare in the rigid hierarchy of the military. "Don't get me wrong," Harris continued. "There will be consequences. Higher command won't let this slide without discussion. But, off the record, I think you did the right thing." For the first time since the incident, Marcus felt a small measure of relief. Yet it was fleeting. Harris's words gave him no certainty about what would come next, only the knowledge that the world was now watching every move he made. That night, Marcus lay in his bunk, unable to sleep. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends, fellow soldiers, and even strangers who had somehow found his number. Some praised him as a hero. Others criticized him for breaking the sacred traditions of the Guard. The noise was overwhelming, but one message stood out, a voicemail from his mother. Her voice cracked with emotion as she said, "Marcus, I saw the video. Your father and I are so proud of you. James would be proud too. You spoke for him today, for all of us. Whatever happens, don't regret it." Marcus closed his eyes, the sound of his mother's voice washing over him. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to cry. Meanwhile, across the country, television networks picked up the story. News anchors debated whether Marcus's actions were justified. Some argued that breaking protocol undermined the dignity of the Guards. Others said his humanity elevated the role, reminding people of the sacrifices behind the uniform. Social media was ablaze with clips of Marcus turning his head, his steady voice cutting through the chaos. Hashtags like #TheSpeakingGuard and #TrueHonor began trending worldwide. In pubs, living rooms, and offices, people watched and rewatched the video. Many who had never cared about ceremonial guards before now felt a deep respect for the man who had spoken, not with anger but with truth. His words about his brother struck a chord far beyond the palace walls, resonating with anyone who had ever known grief, sacrifice, or respect for service. But not everyone was supportive. Military traditionalists condemned Marcus, calling his actions reckless and disrespectful. Editorials appeared in newspapers warning against humanizing ceremonial soldiers in a way that could weaken their symbolic power. Letters poured into the palace, some praising Marcus as a hero, others demanding his dismissal by the following morning. The story had escalated into something bigger than Marcus himself. His actions had sparked a national conversation about tradition versus humanity, about the meaning of respect, and about the role of soldiers in public life. Marcus reported for duty as usual, though whispers followed him through the barracks. Some of his fellow guards clapped him on the shoulder, calling him brave. Others avoided his gaze, clearly uneasy with what he had done. The split was obvious. Just as the nation was divided, so were the men who stood beside him in uniform. The tourists outside Buckingham Palace were different too. When Marcus took his post, the crowd was thicker than usual, their eyes wide with anticipation. They weren't just here for the changing of the guard anymore. They were here to see him. Some waved, others mouthed words of thanks, and many held up their phones to record. Marcus ignored it all, standing as still as ever, though inside he felt the weight of their expectations pressing against his chest. Hours later, as he marched back from duty, he overheard 2 young children talking to their parents. "That's the guard who spoke," one whispered. "He's not just a statue, he's a real hero." The words stopped Marcus in his tracks. Hero? He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had broken rules because his grief had left him no choice. But to those children, and to millions watching online, his actions had meant something far greater than he could have imagined. Yet Marcus knew the hardest part was still to come. Rumors were already circulating of an inquiry being launched into his conduct. Higher command would soon summon him, and his future in the Guard hung in the balance as he lay in bed that night. Staring at the ceiling, Marcus whispered a promise to his brother. "Whatever happens, James, I'll keep honoring you. Even if I lose this uniform, I won't lose what it stands for. Outside his window, London carried on, as always. The city lights flickered against the night sky, unaware of the storm brewing within the walls of Buckingham Palace. The man who had broken centuries of silence was about to face judgment, not just from his commanders, but from a world that couldn't stop watching. By the third day after the incident, the palace could no longer avoid addressing the growing media storm. Every major outlet had covered the story of the guard who broke silence, and public opinion was becoming a tidal wave. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace not just for the spectacle of the changing of the guard, but for the chance to catch a glimpse of Marcus Williams. He had become a living symbol, admired, criticized, debated, and adored inside the barracks. The tension was suffocating. Marcus went through the motions of his duties, but he could feel the weight of every gaze upon him. His fellow guards tried to act normal, yet the atmosphere had shifted. Conversations quieted when he entered a room. Jokes stopped mid-sentence. Marcus was no longer just another soldier among them. He was the man who had brought their centuries-old traditions into question. That morning, Sergeant Harris summoned him to a private office. Marcus expected a reprimand or formal orders, but instead, Harris slid a folded document across the desk. "This came from command," he said gravely. "You're being called before the review board tomorrow." Marcus nodded, his face betraying no emotion, though his stomach tightened. "Understood, sir. You should know," Harris added. "The board isn't just about punishment. They want answers. The public is demanding clarity, and the Crown can't ignore that. What you say in that room may decide your future." Marcus left the office with his mind churning. The idea of speaking before the review board filled him with unease, not because he feared punishment, but because he knew his every word would ripple far beyond the palace walls. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore, he was speaking for every soldier who had ever carried grief behind a stoic face. That evening, as he walked through the palace courtyard, Marcus noticed a cluster of reporters standing near the gates. Microphones and cameras pointed his way, their voices rising with questions. "Marcus, do you regret breaking protocol? Was it worth risking your career? What do you say to those calling you a disgrace?" He did not respond, as silence was his shield now. But among the shouting voices, one quieter sound caught his attention. A young boy stood with his mother, clutching a hand-drawn picture of a guard in a red tunic. His voice trembled as he called out, "Thank you for talking. You made me brave at school." Marcus paused. The boy's words pierced deeper than any question. Without moving too close, Marcus gave a subtle nod. It was a small gesture, but to the boy, it meant everything. The cameras captured it, and within hours, the moment went viral, another piece of the unfolding story that the world couldn't look away from. That night, Marcus found it impossible to sleep. He sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the folded letter his mother had sent after watching his video. Her words still echoed in his mind. James would be proud. He replayed his brother's laughter in his head. The way James used to tell him that courage wasn't about standing still, it was about knowing when to move. The morning of the review board arrived with a gray, overcast sky. Marcus dressed carefully in his freshly cleaned uniform, every button polished to perfection. Despite the stain of controversy, he wanted to show respect to the traditions he had lived by. As he marched toward the hall where the board awaited, his footsteps echoed against the stone corridors. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy. A long oak table stretched across the room, behind which sat a panel of high-ranking officers and advisors. Colonel Hartley was among them, his stern gaze fixed on Marcus. Beside Hartley sat members of the Palace Council, representatives of both the military and the royal household. Marcus stood at attention, his posture straight, his hands steady at his sides. "Guardsman Williams," Hartley began, his voice formal, "you are here today to answer for your actions on duty. You broke protocol by speaking while posted. This is a serious breach of conduct. Do you admit this?" "Yes, sir," Marcus replied clearly. "I broke protocol." A murmur ran through the room. There was no attempt at denial, no excuse, just acknowledgement. "Why?" asked another member of the board, an older man with sharp eyes. "Why did you defy the traditions that define this institution?" Marcus drew a breath, because in that moment, silence would not have been strength. "I was faced with disrespect, not only toward myself but toward the uniform and the values it represents. My brother died serving those values. His memory lives in how I carry this uniform. To stand silent as it was dishonored would have betrayed everything he believed in." The room was silent. Marcus continued, his voice steady but filled with quiet emotion. "I did not speak out of anger. I did not break discipline to shame or humiliate. I spoke because I saw a man drowning in his own pain, lashing out in anger, and I knew that cruelty could not be answered with more cruelty. If I had stayed silent, I would have missed the chance to show the strength of compassion." One of the advisors leaned forward. "You realize that your words have gone beyond this palace. The entire world is now looking at us, questioning whether tradition must bend to humanity. Do you understand the weight of what you've done?" "Yes," Marcus said, "and I accept that weight. I will accept any punishment you see fit. But I will not regret speaking, because sometimes the world needs to be reminded that we are not statues. We are men, and behind the silence there are hearts that still beat." The panel exchanged glances. Some faces softened, while others remained stern. Colonel Hartley finally spoke again. "What you did was dangerous, Williams. If every guard broke protocol whenever moved by emotion, the entire foundation of this role would collapse. But what you said, and how you said it, has reached more people than this institution has in decades. That cannot be ignored." Marcus stood quietly, letting the words sink in. After a long pause, the board announced their decision would be deferred. "You will remain on duty until further notice," Hartley declared. "The matter requires careful deliberation." Marcus saluted and left the chamber, his mind buzzing. The uncertainty was heavy, but he knew he had spoken his truth. Whatever came next, he would face it with the same discipline and dignity that had guided him since his first day as a soldier. Outside the palace walls, the debate raged louder than ever. Some newspapers labeled Marcus a revolutionary figure, while others painted him as a reckless soldier who endangered centuries of tradition. But among ordinary people, his words had lit a fire. Veterans wrote letters thanking him for showing the humanity of service. Families shared his speech with their children. Students debated his actions in classrooms. That evening, as Marcus walked back to his quarters, he saw candles flickering along the palace gates. Citizens had placed them there in memory of fallen soldiers, many leaving notes addressed to Marcus personally. Messages like, "You reminded us what honor really means, and silence is not always golden," covered the walls. For Marcus, it was overwhelming. He had never sought recognition or attention. He had only wanted to honor his brother and uphold the dignity of the uniform. Yet here he was, at the center of something much larger than himself. He whispered quietly as he touched one of the notes. "James, this is for you." The world was waiting for the final judgment on his future. But for Marcus, the true decision had already been made. No matter the outcome, he had chosen compassion over silence, and in doing so, he had changed more than he could ever have imagined. The following week brought an unexpected twist. While the military board quietly deliberated Marcus Williams's fate, the story had grown too large for silence. International outlets picked up the footage of the guard speaking in defiance of tradition. In America, morning talk shows praised his composure and empathy. In Europe, columnists debated whether military traditions were outdated relics or sacred institutions. Even in countries far removed from Britain, the story of a soldier who spoke with humanity resonated deeply. Marcus, meanwhile, found himself moving through daily routines like a man caught in two worlds. On the surface, he was still a guardsman, marching, standing, saluting, maintaining posture. But beneath the uniform, he was now a symbol being dissected by millions. His name had become a hashtag. His face appeared on magazine covers. Strangers debated his motives as if they knew his heart better than he did inside the barracks. The tension was more complicated than before. Some fellow guards avoided him, worried that being associated with him might harm their own careers. Others whispered encouragement in private, telling him he had given voice to emotions they had long suppressed. One younger guard, barely 19, stopped him in the corridor and said, "Sir, when I lost my dad last year, I thought I had to hide it all. Seeing you, it helped." The words struck Marcus deeply. He realized that his action, reckless as it might have seemed, had opened a door for others who wore the uniform. But with that realization came a heavy burden. Could he live up to the role thrust upon him? Could he carry the weight of being both a soldier and a symbol of change? The Palace Council, sensing the growing momentum of public opinion, decided to hold a press briefing. For the first time in decades, they would address the actions of a single guardsman directly. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed Marcus would be dismissed publicly. Others believed he would be quietly reassigned. And a few whispered of a more radical outcome, that his words had struck a chord even within the palace walls. On the morning of the briefing, Marcus was summoned by Colonel Hartley. The older man's expression was difficult to read, as though balancing frustration with reluctant admiration. "Williams," Hartley said firmly, "today will shape not just your future, but possibly the future of this institution. You must remember that every eye will be on you. Do not falter. Do not let your emotions overrun your discipline again." "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, though in his heart he knew discipline alone would not guide him this time. When he stepped into the hall, rows of journalists filled the seats. Cameras clicked. Lights glared. The air buzzed with anticipation. At the center of the room stood a podium, and beside it, a chair for Marcus. He sat down, his posture erect, his eyes steady. The spokesperson for the palace began with formal words. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending. As you are aware, Guardsman Marcus Williams recently broke standing protocol during his duty. This matter is under review. However, given the public attention it has received, we wish to provide transparency." The spokesperson gestured toward Marcus. "Guardsman Williams will now answer limited questions." The first journalist rose immediately. "Marcus, do you regret speaking?" Marcus paused, then said calmly, "No, I regret the circumstances that led to the disrespect of the uniform, but I do not regret speaking. I believe silence would have been the greater betrayal." Another journalist shouted, "Do you believe tradition should change because of one moment?" Marcus held the gaze of the room. "Tradition is not stone, it is living. It endures because it adapts. I broke protocol, Yes, but I did so to uphold something greater, compassion. If our traditions cannot hold space for humanity, then what do they truly protect? The room buzzed with murmurs. The words were bold, almost audacious, but they struck a chord. Cameras captured every flicker of expression, every nuance of his voice. A reporter from a veterans publication asked softly, "You mentioned your brother in your speech that day. Was that the reason you chose to respond differently?" The question pierced Marcus's chest. He straightened slightly. "Yes, my brother James died in service just weeks before. He lived by values of honor and dignity. When I stood there facing disrespect, I thought of him. I thought of what he would want me to do. I knew silence would dishonor his memory. Speaking was my way of keeping him alive." A hush fell over the hall. For a moment, even the reporters lowered their pens. The briefing ended shortly afterward, but the impact was immediate. Clips of Marcus's words flooded social media, broadcast with captions like, "Tradition meets humanity and the God who spoke for millions." For every critic who accused him of weakness, there were thousands who praised his courage. That evening, Marcus returned to his quarters, drained but oddly calm. He removed his uniform with care, hanging it neatly as always. As he sat on his bed, a knock sounded at the door. It was Dr. Patel, the historian who had witnessed the original incident. "I wanted to thank you," Patel said warmly. "Not as a historian, but as a man. You reminded the world that traditions mean nothing without the people who live them." Marcus nodded, his throat tight. "I only did what I felt was right." "Exactly," Patel replied, "and that is what makes it remarkable." The following days blurred into a whirlwind of coverage and speculation. Editorials debated whether Marcus had tarnished the God or elevated it. Opinion polls revealed surprising numbers. The majority of citizens supported him. Veterans wrote open letters, sharing their own struggles with silence and grief. Even schoolchildren wrote essays about courage after watching his video. But inside Marcus, the storm had not calmed. Each time he looked at his uniform, he wondered if he had betrayed it or redefined it. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw James's face, smiling but distant, as though urging him onward. The decision of the review board still loomed. Would they punish him for defiance, or acknowledge the power of what he had done? Marcus had no answer, only patience. One evening, walking through the quiet courtyard after duty, Marcus stopped beneath the statue of an unknown soldier. He stood silently for several minutes, the cool night air wrapping around him. Finally, he whispered into the stillness, "If I am punished, let it be worth it. Let it mean something." A tourist passing nearby, not realizing who he was, snapped a photo of the solitary guard speaking into the night. That photo, too, spread across the internet, captioned, "The Weight of Honor." Marcus Williams had become more than a soldier. He had become a question mark hanging over tradition, a story that touched hearts far beyond palace walls. But his own heart remained unsettled. He had spoken once. Would he be silenced forever, or would his voice continue to echo? The answer would come soon enough. The board had called him to return the following week for their final judgment. The world waited with bated breath, and Marcus, though uncertain of his fate, prepared himself for whatever came, ready to face punishment, ready to face freedom, but most of all, ready to honor his brother one last time. The day of judgment arrived beneath heavy skies. Rain slicked the cobblestones outside the palace, and the crowd that gathered pressed together beneath umbrellas, waiting for news of the God whose silence had broken the worlds. Television crews jostled for space. Reporters whispered predictions. Some believed Marcus would be dismissed in disgrace. Others insisted his defiance had shifted something too deeply to ignore. Inside, Marcus Williams stood alone in a narrow corridor outside the chamber. He wore his full uniform, spotless and pressed, though he knew every thread carried memories of humiliation, compassion, and grief. His gloves tightened against his palms. His jaw set hard. He told himself he was ready for whatever came, yet his heart pounded with the weight of uncertainty. The doors opened. Colonel Hartley emerged, his face unreadable. "They're ready for you," he said simply. Marcus stepped into the chamber. Around a long oak table sat the members of the review board, senior officers, officials, advisors. The air was heavy with formality. At the head of the table sat the presiding officer, a decorated general whose eyes studied Marcus with piercing intensity. "Guardsman Williams," the general began, his voice even, "you are here because you broke the silence that defines your duty. You spoke while on ceremonial post. You broke centuries of tradition. Do you acknowledge this?" "Yes, sir," Marcus replied without hesitation. "I acknowledge it fully. And do you understand the gravity of such an action?" "I do, sir." He paused, his voice steady. "But I also believe the gravity of silence would have been greater." Murmurs rippled through the room, quickly silenced by a raised hand. "You will explain yourself," the general commanded. Marcus inhaled deeply. 3 weeks before that day, I buried my brother. He died in service. He believed in dignity, in honor, in humanity. When a man threw food at me, dishonoring not just me but what my uniform represents, I thought of James. He would not have wanted me to endure humiliation in silence. He would have wanted me to respond with humanity, not retaliation. And so I spoke. I did not curse. I did not strike. I asked a man if he was all right, because sometimes the greatest show of strength is kindness. The silence that followed felt endless. The board members shifted, their expressions caught between duty and conscience. One officer leaned forward. Do you realize the precedent you may have set? Others may follow your example. Marcus met his gaze. If they follow compassion, then it is a precedent I can accept. The general's eyes narrowed slightly, as though testing him. And if your act undermines centuries of discipline, then discipline must be strong enough to withstand humanity, Marcus said firmly. Another silence, heavier than the first. The words hung in the air like a challenge, undeniable and impossible to ignore. At last the general spoke again. You are dismissed. Wait outside while we deliberate. Marcus bowed slightly and stepped into the corridor. His heart thudded in his chest. Outside the palace, the waiting crowd grew restless. Sensing that history was unfolding behind the closed doors, an hour passed. Then, too, Marcus stood, motionless but tense, every sound magnified in his ears. At last, the doors opened again. Colonel Hartley beckoned him in. The general rose from his chair. Guardsman Marcus Williams, he declared, his voice ringing with finality. The board has reached its decision. Your actions were in violation of protocol. For this, it will be officially recorded as having breached discipline. Marcus braced himself. However, the general continued, his tone shifting. The board also recognizes that your actions carried extraordinary humanity, restraint, and moral courage. You did not undermine the God, you reminded the world why it exists. For that reason, you will not be dismissed. Instead, you will be reassigned. A murmur swept through the chamber. The general continued, effective immediately. You are to serve as a ceremonial instructor, tasked with preparing new guards. Your duty will include not only discipline but also the values you demonstrated: restraint, dignity, and compassion. Marcus's breath caught. He had expected disgrace or silence, never this. He bowed his head. Thank you, sir. Outside the chamber, the news spread like wildfire. When Marcus stepped onto the palace steps, the waiting crowd erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed, but what struck him most were the cheers. People from across the world had gathered, holding signs that read, "True strength is compassion," and the God who spoke for the first time in weeks. Marcus allowed himself the faintest smile, not for glory, not for fame, but for the knowledge that his brother's memory had shaped something greater. That evening, as the rain cleared and the palace lights glowed against the night sky, Marcus walked alone to the statue of the unknown soldier once more. He stood in silence, the cool air filling his lungs. "James," he whispered, his voice breaking slightly, "I didn't let them forget you. I didn't let them forget what this uniform means." The courtyard was empty, but he felt less alone than ever before. In the days that followed, Marcus began his new role. He stood before young recruits, teaching them how to march, how to stand, how to endure. But he also spoke quietly of values of service, of dignity, of compassion. He told them that strength was not measured in silence alone, but in knowing when to speak. The recruits listened, wide-eyed, realizing they were learning not just from a soldier, but from a man who had lived what he taught. And beyond the palace, the world continued to replay the moment. Millions watched the clip again and again, not for drama, but for the glimpse of humanity within tradition. In schools, classrooms discussed the meaning of honor. In households, families talked about compassion. Marcus had not only broken protocol, he had broken silence. And in doing so, he had left millions not just shocked, but changed. His story would be told for years, not as a scandal, but as a reminder that even in the most rigid of roles, humanity must never be forgotten. And though Marcus Williams remained just one man in a red coat and bearskin hat, standing in a courtyard of history, he had become something larger, a voice echoing across time, reminding the world that dignity is not found in silence alone, but in the courage to choose compassion, even when it costs everything.